Invoices getting paid twice. Grrr. In this episode, we look at 3 reasons why invoices get paid twice, along with some common examples and advice on how you can stop it. Welcome to Accounts Payable Soundbites, the program where we share tips and explain simple and complex accounts payable issues in short, concise soundbites. So, why do we make such a big deal about this issue, you ask? Won't the vendor simply return the duplicate payment? The harsh reality is, in most cases, like 99% of the cases, the answer is no. They are overworked. It'll go into a suspense account and they'll investigate that duplicate payment when they have some spare time, which, as many of you know, in many instances is never. Okay, good intentions, but it doesn't get done. Some will give you a credit memo in an attempt to do the right thing. Okay, and they are doing the right thing. But these credit memos may or may not make it down to your accounts payable staff. And even if they do, the staff may or may not know what to do with them. But that's another issue for another video. So let's go over the 3 reasons real quickly. Number 1, your processes are not up to snuff. Number 2, you don't pay on time, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, and we'll address this in a little bit more detail, your vendors may knowingly set out to deceive you. And even if they don't knowingly or they're not intentionally trying to deceive you, some of the practices they use to deceive you may be standard practices in their organization. So it doesn't matter what their intent is. If you pay them twice and you don't get the money back, the end result is still the same. So we want to stop that. Okay, so let's dive right in and start with number 1. Your processes aren't up to snuff. Okay, so what can you do about these? What am I talking about? Well, the number 1 thing that you can do, and this doesn't cost a red cent. In fact, none of the things that I'm going to talk about cost anything. And it will guard against a huge percentage of your duplicate payments, is to have a rigid coding standard. Not only do you want to set up this coding standard for your folks to use, you also want to periodically check and make sure that they are using it. Because if you set it up and they don't use it, you may as well not have wasted the time. Okay. Along the same lines, you want to have standard processes for processing invoices. So when that second invoice shows up and the person goes to process it, it's quickly identified or easily identified as a duplicate. Clearly, you want to have appropriate segregation of duties. We're not going to go into that in any great detail, but that will also help. And you should have, which I know many of you have, set up a separate account for emailed invoices so that doesn't become an issue. And of course, verify anytime somebody asks you anything out of the ordinary. There's a lot more that you can do, a lot more best practices, but really just focusing on that coding standard and standardized practices will get you a long way along the path. And of course, if you've automated, that possibly can help, assuming that you've done it in a meaningful manner and that you also check for duplicates. Okay, which I'm assuming you do. All right. That's number 1. Number 2, you don't pay on time. And when I say you don't pay on time, I'm not only talking about those who strategically drag out payments. So maybe the payment terms are 60 days, but you don't pay in 60 days, you pay in 90 days. Or if you're an American company, more likely your terms are 30 days, but you stretch everybody out to 45 or 60 days. That's one instance of not paying on time. And in another instance of not paying on time, you just don't pay on time. You can't get the invoice processed. You can't get it out the door for whatever reason. So it doesn't get paid on time. Then the vendor sends the second invoice, a second copy of the invoice. They may use some of the practices we're going to discuss a little further on, but whatever, they send that second invoice. And when that second invoice shows up, your folks pay it for a variety of reasons. Okay, so the simple answer is pay on time, and the vendor then does not have a legitimate reason to send a second copy of the invoice, and you don't go down that path. All right. Before we get to the real kicking you in the you-know-what, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. It's free, completely private, and you can unsubscribe at any time. And on YouTube, if you ring the bell next to the subscribe button, which is down below, you'll be notified when we post new accounts payable content. which we do 2 or 3 times a week. And by the way, you don't need a YouTube account to subscribe. You can subscribe if you have a Gmail account. Okay, the last issue, the vendor knowingly deceives you. Now, even if they don't do it knowingly and they're not trying to deceive you, but they use some of the practices that we're going to talk about, you're in the same boat. You need to take the same steps because, the bottom line, money's gone out the door. Okay. Now, there is a practice among some organizations, it's being advocated by some consultants, to send a second invoice before the invoice due date, maybe on the due date or a few days before. I honestly don't know what legitimate purpose this has. The rationale is maybe it will remind the company that they need to pay the invoice, but you don't need that reminder, okay? And the belief is, and I could be wrong about this, but at least in certain cases, the companies are sending that second invoice before the due date with the hope of getting a second payment. Okay. They change the invoice number, and a whole bunch of vendors do it. Sometimes they do it just by adding like an A or a B to the invoice number, and sometimes they change it completely. This makes it increasingly difficult for you to identify that invoice as a duplicate, because let's face it, most of us rely on that invoice number. So that's the second thing that they do. And then the third thing, and there can be more, is they send a second invoice with a different total amount, and that different total is supposedly for legitimate reasons. So, for example, they may have included a late fee, which you may not pay, but anyway, by including that late fee, the dollar amount is different, or they may include some older unpaid invoices on it, or maybe a freight charge that you didn't agree to pay, whatever. The amount is different, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for you to identify this. If you have any tricks that you've encountered with some of your vendors playing games on you to try and get you to pay a duplicate, trying to pay twice, perhaps you could enter it in the comments below so we could all be aware of what's going on. So, all these things that I'm talking about, what can you do? Strong processes, like we talked in the first issue, will root out many of these, if not all of them. That's why we make such a big deal about best practices. Now, AP Now has another short video on best practices, and we'll make a link available to it in the show notes. And on YouTube, you might see that to the right. So our best practice recommendation, once you find a company employing these methods, you want to put them on what I call an act list, and always check thoroughly list, and then double check all their invoices. Because if they did it once, they're going to be doing it again. And you might want to make sure you don't fall for that. We also have a video on why best practices matter. It's a short video. It's soundbite number 15. There's a link to it below in the show notes. And again, on YouTube, it should show up to the left. As always, we wish you the best of luck in fighting against this scourge, if you will, of making duplicate payments. And we always do appreciate those thumbs up, those shares, those comments. So good luck. Thanks.